So now that decolonization has entirely remapped the world, literally, physically, and politically, does that mean that imperialism just dissipates and that we see a radical change? In fact, the world is still globally connected, and much of what happens after the Cold War and decolonization, in fact, keeps on carrying forward the specter and the legacy of imperialism because it generates a practice of immigration and migration as something that European powers are also now trying to encourage. Now, the politics of decolonizations were tumultuous in Europe, as in the colonies. And what happens is that formerly subject people leave their homelands upon independence to seek for themselves the benefits of what this colonial society seemed to have promised. So we see an increase of labor migrations after World War II. And that is in large part because Europe needs cheap labor for the rebuilding of its nations. And upon arriving, these former colonized peoples do not find the freedom and prosperity Europe had always flaunted and promised. Now, we might ask ourselves, why did people leave once independent? Well, there were often places where decolonization had occurred with warfare and violence. So independence did not necessarily mean peace, prosperity. It also meant recovering and rebuilding from the exploitation, political, economic, social of colonialism and its violent end. Think of Indochina, that indeed becomes independent in 1954, only to be embroiled in the Vietnam War for the next 2 decades. This is also the situation for certain African countries. The partition of British colonial India in 1947 led to the massive relocation of Muslims to Pakistan and Hindus to India, and violence in the process. So what you have is, in fact, this economic prosperity is entirely built upon the aftermath of decolonization and a turn to cheap labor and a request for migrants to come and do this cheap labor. And European countries used different strategies. France especially encouraged unskilled male laborers and workers to come, and those came predominantly from Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. But then these workers who had left their families behind were often segregated in barracks and shanty towns, living in very difficult conditions. Other countries like Germany and Sweden established state-funded guest worker systems. So the problem is, in fact, is that as refugees and migrants arrive from the colonies, European nations write laws to disqualify them from citizenship and equal treatment, all the while marginalize them socially and economically. Now, many migrants enter the countries that have actively sought them, and yet they do not find equality or the kind of prosperity they were promised. And this is in large part because of a lagging demographic boom. For instance, in West Germany in 1950, the German working age population, that is between 15 and 64, was 15 million men and 18 million women in an ideological climate where women were sent back home. So labor was available. And yet what happened? As one German critic of the German state said, we wanted workers and we got human beings. So for instance, Turks flooded Germany in fulfillment of international agreements that they would help rebuild in the face of labor shortage, and in compensation would be guaranteed social and economic equity. But German citizenship at the time is premised on blood, not soil, which means that however long they stayed, and even if they had children and grandchildren born and raised in Germany, German Turks essentially could never be Germans. And this was only changed in the 1990s. In other cases, the situation was complicated. So between 1947 and 1954, 1 million North Africans entered France as cheap labor force. And to add to that, in 62, Algerian independence brought an enormous influx of refugees of families to the French mainland. This came to be known as the Exodus and was unforeseen by French officials. Now, for instance, Algerian Jews chose to go to France rather than Israel. Former army auxiliaries, the Harkis, who had been threatened by Algerian nationalists, also migrated to France. Now, whatever their backgrounds, all these people were legally French citizens because Algeria had been declared a legal part of France before its independence. However, to mainline French people, they weren't quite French. They were pieds noirs, or black feet. Think of Claude François and how he represents this. And people were not treated equally. Harkis, for instance, were relocated at first in camps that had housed Jews during World War II. And this meant that questions of citizenship became questions of racialization, and where racism and the aftermath of colonialism really shaped these discussions. So Germany and France both turned to North Africa and then to sub-Saharan countries in the late 60s. And in the late 70s, clandestine workers from Africa and Asia began entering countries like Italy. Now, all of these were first welcome as guest workers, that is, without family. They were forced to live in their own enclaves, barracks, shantytown, formerly camps. They were ineligible for all the rights guaranteed by the welfare state. They were not protected by labor legislation. And in fact, they were asked to pay taxes, but never receive allowance. Now, in Britain, the situation was slightly different because there was also another category that came straight after the war because of Britain's Caribbean possessions. Many of these were World War II veterans. And we see that too in the Netherlands, where people from the former Dutch colonies of Suriname and Indonesia headed there to make a living. By the 1980s, approximately 8% of the European population was of non-European origin, compared to only 6% in the US. And this is why one post-colonial Black British scholar has said, this is when the empire comes home. This will lead to huge changes. That is, you have second generation, the children of those migrants who came, who grow up, are French, British, yet still second class culturally, economically, and politically. And this is when, indeed, the empire strikes back, as this same Black British critic said. Now, I want you to think of the fact that your textbook only has one sentence that speaks to the protests and riots in 1981 in the midst of the Thatcher years. But in fact, the 1980s are extremely important. The arrival of large numbers of people of non-European lineage prompted European politicians to start focusing very explicitly on race and to invent this problem, the question of immigration. In Britain, anxious political leaders, especially early in the 70s and later in the 80s, started singling out those who had arrived from the West Indies, India, and Pakistan. And we see an increase throughout those decades of racist riots. And in fact, ways in which to try and really deny that Britain had been an empire. So governments tried to pass anti-immigration bills, and from 1965, 1968, despite legislation mandating equal treatment in housing, jobs, and advertising, as the economy worsened in the 1970s, Britain hardened its attitude towards its migrants that they had requested and its foreign residents. So the political climate in Europe is prominently shaped by racist rhetoric combined with economic and social concerns. And studies have showed that in the 70s and 80s, racism was widespread and discrimination was, of course, rise. But it's not as if migrants and their children did not react. In fact, in France, workers from North Africa who had been the first to enter the country as cheap labor became politically active in the 1970s, pushing for family reunification and better living conditions. In 1980, the Bonnet Law, the National Assembly passed the Bonnet Law, which drastically limited immigration and the rights of immigrants. And it's only as second-generation North Africans, French people of North African descent moved into leadership position during debates on these issues that they tipped the focus of French immigrant activism towards civil rights in their own homeland. So the early 1980s is in fact an incredibly exciting time where a number of marches against racism are organized throughout the country and elsewhere in Europe. This is the creation of a slogan, an anti-racist slogan, designed to encourage everyone to become an anti-racist. And it says, touche pas à mon pote, don't harm, touch my friend. And this emerged after a massive march that took place from the south of France to Paris, involving hundreds of thousands of French citizens, many second generation. This was historic. It was the Marche des Beurs in 1983. And I encourage you to watch a video with the archival footage without subtitles, unfortunately. There are no of this particular march. So in Sweden, we have coalitions such as Stop Racism and Hassan's Friends that are formed to eliminate those disadvantaged and their children. And in England especially, we have the emergence of what we call the Black British movement and a number of very vibrant and active movements. There's Southall Black Sisters, but also in East London and South London. And Black British meant that people understood Black as a political category because you had both South Asians and Caribbean or African first and second generation British who saw themselves as Black British. And one of its icons is Linton Kwesi Johnson, who is known to be the first dub poet. Now, Linton Kwesi Johnson is a remarkable poet. He was born in 1502 in Jamaica and came to London in 1963, where he studied sociology at Goldsmith College in London. While still in school, he joined the Black Panthers, helped to organize a poetry workshop within the movement, and developed his work with Rasta Love, a group of poets and drummers. And he became a writer in residence thanks to financial support. And his first poems appeared in the journal Race Today, and his first collection of poetry in 1974, Voices of the Living, still in the same journal. Now, he also launched his own record label in 1981 with 2 singles by a Jamaican poet and others, and then became immersed in journalism, working closely with the Brixton-based Race Today collective. Now, he also toured regularly with his dub band and produced albums. Now, what you're going to listen to is one of his most famous performances, and it tells you something about the kind of political argument that takes shape in culture. And I encourage you to watch Linton Kwesi Johnson and his dub poem from 1980, England is a Bitch. Once you've looked at this, I want you to think about the ways in which popular culture can tell us about politics and society, for us to think about what we're going to close out next week.